To hear the full version of this and many more audiobooks, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support. Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance by Roland Bohr, School of Marxism, Dalian, University of Technology, Dalian, China. 2021. For Zhang Fengyu, an old friend. Preface. What a difference a crisis makes. As I write this preface, the year that was, 2020, challenged the world with the COVID-19 pandemic, and which countries stood tall, mobilizing effective measures to contain the pandemic until vaccines could be produced. China, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, and other socialist countries. Clearly, their political systems have matured to a point at which they can make rapid decisions, enact mechanisms for the speedy deployment of specialists and core personnel, redirect industry to produce much-needed equipment, and count on society-wide cooperation and support. I hardly need to point out that, with very rare exceptions, countries that draw upon the Western liberal tradition, with its bourgeois capitalist political structures and its cultural assumptions of the primacy of the private individual, have foundered and struggled mightily to put together anything that looks like a coherent approach to the pandemic. What is it about the political structures of socialist countries that has enabled such a success? This book is at least part of an answer. We need to go back to the roots of the Marxist tradition to identify the initial principles of socialist governance. The one who made such a contribution was Friedrich Engels. Yes, Engels, the man who so often plays second fiddle to Marx, has far more to offer on this question than many may expect. This is as true of the theory of hitherto existing forms of the state as it is of the form of socialist governance that should develop after a proletarian revolution. This is what the book offers, a careful reading of often neglected texts by Engels, with a view to determining the principles of socialist governance. Why socialist governance, and not, for example, socialist politics or the socialist state? Those infused with Western liberal assumptions and indeed Western Marxism may find that the terminology of governance belongs more to the domain of management studies and such like. However, I have chosen the term socialist governance carefully. Why? To begin with, for Engels, the idea of a socialist state would be an oxymoron, since he saw any form of the state as a separated public power, and since he proposed that in a socialist system a public power would, by contrast, be enmeshed within society. I could not use the terminology of a socialist state. Further, since both Engels and Marx define politics in terms of the manifestation of class struggle and proposed de-politicized elections and consultations in a socialist system, socialist politics would also not be appropriate, hence the terminology of socialist governance, which captures best the basic principles Engels espoused. One final reason: the English translation of 3 important volumes by Xi Jinping is The Governance of China, 治国理政. The Chinese may also be translated as Manage State Affairs or Governing a Country. This book's title is also meant to reflect such a usage, and indeed a notable continuity from Engels to China today. The research embodied in this book has benefited from guidance, suggestions, criticism, and encouragement of many. They include Zhang Shuangli, Domenico Lacerdo, Yang Huilin, Hong Xiaonan, Fang Yu Mei, Liu Guixiang, Yan Ping, Dick Bohr, Yu Min, Zhou Dan, Stefano Azzara, and particularly an old friend, Zhang Fengyu. All through, Christina has been intimately involved with the thoughts developed here, as we discuss almost daily her projects and mine, all in light of our common project. Roland Bohr, Christiansfeld, Southern Jutland, Denmark, February 2021. About the author. Roland Bohr is a professor of Marxist philosophy in the School of Marxism, Dalian University of Technology, China. He is the first non-Chinese citizen to be employed in a school of Marxism in China. Among numerous publications, he is the author of the 5-volume work, The Criticism of Heaven and Earth, Brill, 2007 to 2014. In 2014, the work was awarded the Isaac and Tamara Duscher Memorial Prize. Most recently, he has published Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, A Guide for Foreigners, Springer, 2021. Abbreviations: IWMA, International Working Men's Association; MECW, Marx and Engels Collected Works, 50 volumes, Moscow, Progress Publishers, 1975 to 2004. MEGA, Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, first series, MEGA, published 13 volumes from 1927 to 1941 at the Marx Engels Verlag in Berlin. Second series, MEGA 2, began in 1975, republishing the earlier volumes and expanding the collection. Initially published by Dietz Verlag in Berlin until 1990, and then by Academy Verlag in Berlin, the planned collection of 114 volumes remains incomplete. MEW, Marx Engels Work, 44 volumes, Berlin, Dietz Verlag, 1956 to 2018. SPD, Sozialdemokratischen Partei Deutschlands. Chapter 1, Introduction and Synopsis. Abstract. The introductory chapter sets the scene by identifying the reason why this study has been undertaken, and how I do so. As to why, it constitutes a search for understanding the nature of socialist governance today, especially in China. As to how, I return to the foundational texts of the Marxist tradition, finding that it is Engels in particular who provides the most comprehensive framework. After a brief word on the inadequacies of the existing and relatively sparse secondary literature, the chapter offers a detailed synopsis of each of the chapters to follow. I close with a word on the method of citations, in which I cite the original language source first, and then the English translation for ease of reference, even if the translations offered are mostly my own. Keywords: Friedrich Engels, Socialist Governance, Citation Method, Secondary Literature, Synopsis. Opening Remarks. It has been apparent to me for some time that the governing system of the socialist country I know best, China, is more mature and increasingly superior to the bourgeois states that derive from Western Europe. How to make sense of this awareness and the empirical reality on the ground? One may consider how a socialist system like that of China responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, or one may delve deep into the structures of governance, society, and economy, as I have done in a work entitled Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, A Guide for Foreigners, or one may give anecdotal accounts of personal day-to-day experiences, which I have also done from time to time. Why Engels? The approach taken in this present work is different. I decided to return to the roots of the Marxist tradition, to the texts of Marx and Engels, to see what they had to say about the shape of governance that might unfold after a proletarian revolution. It is a leitmotif of Marxist scholarship that Marx did not write a systematic work on the state. One may perhaps write an article or chapter on what he did and did not say, but beyond that there is nothing much. The more I undertook the research, the more I realized that it is Engels who has far more to offer than Marx's relatively cryptic formulations. Indeed, Engels is the one, particularly in the relatively unstudied material written in the 1880s and early 1890s, who provides the main groundwork for a historical and dialectical materialist theory of the state. More than the state, which he defines as a separated public power, for he also provides the basic philosophical principles for what may be called socialist governance. On this type of governance, Marx left us with an unresolved contradiction between the Paris Commune and the dictatorship of the proletariat. He made some tentative moves to resolve the contradiction, but his energy was on other projects rather than the state as such. It fell to Engels to develop such a theory, especially when Marx's energy had waned, and after he died in 1883. This book is an effort to explicate this theory in light of all the relevant material. Yes, all. This effort means that the book has some quite detailed analyses of key texts, but this is the only way to gain a complete sense of what Engels tried to convey. Rather than leaving the question begging to the very end, let me state here what Engels proposes concerning socialist governance. It entails that public power, Gewalt, a term we will meet frequently, loses its political character and focuses on the administration of the stuff of life and conduct of the economy for the good of the whole community. Gemeinwesen. This means that such a public power stands in the midst of society, rather than separate from and opposed to it. Far from being simpler and local, as the anarchists would have it, this approach is even more complex and detailed than anything we have seen before. So much so that it constitutes a whole new level of authority, sovereignty, and power. This is not all, for in extensive research later in life, especially into the German Mark, Engels argued for a dialectical transformation, an Aufhebung, to a whole new qualitative level of original or baseline communism and its democracy. These concise points require a significant amount of explanation and exegesis of Engels's text in order to show how he arrives at such formulations. Secondary literature. In a moment, I will offer an outline of the arguments of each of the chapters of the book, but first a word on secondary literature. It is quite sparse, particularly work that focuses on Engels' distinct contribution. Footnote. In this work, I do not engage with Chinese language material, for that is the main focus of another work. End of footnote. Most of the material available focuses on Marx, with either dismissals of Engels' contribution or at most deploying Engels to fill in some gaps. Footnote. I leave aside those interested in nothing more than hitherto existing states, since I refer to them in this chapter and focus on material that deals with what happens after a communist revolution. End of footnote. Further, the works referenced here tend to be highly selective in the range of texts discussed, with the result that the conclusions reached are somewhat skewed. This is particularly so with the dying away of the state, which is seen as either an expression of the core anarchist position of Marxism itself, or somewhat of a fig leaf for authoritarianism, or as a dismantling of the structures of governance very soon after a proletarian revolution. At times, the selection emphasizes one feature at the expense of others, the most notable being a liking for the Paris Commune and a downplaying of the proletarian dictatorship, let alone socialist Gewalt. In other words, there is very little that engages with the important material Engels produced in the late 1870s and especially the 1880s, and into the 1890s. There are one or two exceptions, although now somewhat dated. The first is the work of Hal Draper, especially those relevant to the current study. While Draper has worked with much of the relevant material, and while his work is helpful as a beginning point of research, like many others, he focuses overwhelmingly on Marx and sidelines Engels. Further, his conclusions have a tendency to confirm his sectarian presuppositions and are not always so helpful. The second is Hunt, whose exhaustive study does at least deal with some of the relevant texts by Engels, although not crucial ones such as the mark or the role of force in history. Yet Hunt's study is vitiated by an assumption found in much of the material mentioned above, namely, that subsequent historical experiences of socialism in power and the arduous task of constructing socialism somehow departed from what Marx and Engels had thought. This book should go at least part of the way to showing how erroneous such an assumption is. Chapter Synopsis. Now, for a synopsis of the content to come. Some of the content will be repeated in the abstracts for each chapter, but the value of this synopsis is that it provides a concise overview of the argument of the book. The next chapter deals initially with Engels's programmatic observations on hitherto existing states, which would set the subsequent agenda for Marxist studies of such states. Apart from noting the key features of this analysis, which involves the core idea of the state as a separated public power, the chapter focuses on Engels's shifts between seeing such states as semi-autonomous as instruments of a particular class in power, or as shaped in their very nature by the class in question. Engels moves between these three overlapping approaches, depending on the point he seeks to make, but he tends in more detailed work to opt for the third, that the nature of the state is determined by the class in power. This position emerges particularly in a relatively ignored work, The Role of Force in History, 1887 to 1888. Here, Engels offers an analysis of Bismarck in Germany that is a close companion to Marx's 18th Brumaire, 1852, with the specific point that the bourgeoisie was able to shape the state in its image indirectly, even when it did not hold the reins of power. Even more important is the emergence of a core category, Gewalt. The word is difficult to translate. Its semantic field includes the senses of force, power, and violence, so I leave the word untranslated. This provides a rather new angle, not only on his proposal that hitherto existing states may be defined as a separated public Gewalt, but also that a public Gewalt exists that is not separated, and that it is necessary for the workers' movement to exercise socialist Gewalt. This point leads to the third chapter concerning socialists, Gewalt, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The key finding of this chapter is Engels' emphasis on proletarian Gewalt. In both the revolutionary process and in the early stages of the construction of socialism when power is gained through a revolution, the concrete manifestation of this socialist Gewalt is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Engels, like Marx, defines carefully not as an individual dictatorship as with Bakunin or by a small band, Blomqvist, but as a collective dictatorship by the majority, the workers. On this basis, Engels' important contribution was to go beyond Marx and identify the Paris Commune with the proletarian dictatorship. The context was a struggle with the moderates of the increasingly large German Social Democratic Party, who tried to dispense with the dictatorship of the proletariat in its program and work within bourgeois democracy. In light of later tendencies in European communism to downplay the proletarian dictatorship and idealize the Paris Commune, for example with Euro-communism and the tendency among some Western Marxists, Engels' explicit argument that the Commune was the exercise of the proletarian dictatorship, even that it did not go far enough in exercising such a dictatorship, is a timely warning. The chapter concludes by analyzing Engels's explicit usage of socialist Gewalt itself, both before and after a revolution. Crucially, Engels points out that political power also has economic influence and potency, potens. The fourth chapter focuses on the dying away of the state in contrast to its abolition, as promulgated by Bakunin and the anarchists in the late 1860s and 1870s. Given the many misunderstandings that surround the idea of the dying away of the state, this is the longest chapter in the book since it analyzes in significant detail all of the relevant material. It begins by studying the wider context in the 1840s among German socialists, finding that while they spoke of the abolition, Abschaffung, annihilation, Vernichtung, and dialectical transformation, Aufhebung, of private property, money, and inheritance, they rarely, if ever, spoke of doing so to the state as such. Instead, they envisioned alternative structures, either of a new state or of a new form of social organization. This is true even of Proudhon, who deeply influenced these early German socialists. There is one notable exception. Max Stirner, in his liberal anarchist work, The Ego and Its Own, 1845, urged that the state should be abolished and annihilated. Thus, only when Engels and Marx and others like Moses Hess engage with Stirner do they speak of the abolition of the state, finding Stirner's proposals wanting since they focus on an act of pure will. It is only in 1850 that Engels and Marx speak directly of the abolition, Abschaffung, of the state for the first time. Notably, this is a critical response to what had become a popular slogan in all manners of circles, including bourgeois ones, where such an abolition entailed a bourgeois order in which they would be left alone to pursue their private gain. Crucially, this piece, which borrows the language of the slogan, identifies Stirner as the source and introduces the need for a delay in such an abolition. This delay is an early result of the method hammered out in the years before and expressed clearly for the first time in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. The primary concern should be socio-economic matters. Thus, a communist revolution would have these as its main task, while any abolition of the state would follow as an outcome of such activity. This would be the position, refined and sharpened, that both Engels and Marx would hold in the struggle with Bakunin, who first formulated a somewhat coherent anarchist position in the late 1860s and particularly in the 1870s. For Bakunin, the state was the prime cause and foundation of all exploitation and oppression, whether political or economic. Thus, the first task of a revolutionary movement upon attaining power should be to abolish, Abschaffung, the state, as a willed and conscious act. Bakunin struggled to show why the state should have this foundational role, at times connecting its quasi-sacred status with the role of the Christian church. But for Engels and Marx, this approach simply did not make sense. In light of their approach, the state was a secondary phenomenon arising from economic conditions and class struggle. Thus, a communist revolution would need to enact wide-sweeping changes to the forces and relations of production before aspects of the superstructure, such as the state, could be addressed. In this context, we find an increasing emphasis that one of the final results of the process of constructing socialism, after other tasks had been achieved and the counter-revolution had been defeated, would be not the abolition of the state, but its falling away, disappearance, going to sleep. The terms all appear in the works of this time. Finally, and as a way to sum up this position, Engels coined in the third edition of Anti-Düring of 1894 the famous slogan, "The state is not abolished, it dies away." The influence of this slogan is due to its appearance in the extracted material that appeared as Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which was read and studied by all communists of the second and third generations. The fifth chapter begins by addressing a contradiction that has arisen in light of the previous two chapters between socialist Gewalt and the dying away of the state. The initial narrative of the former passing to the latter, which is part of Engels's approach, addresses neither how authority and Gewalt would continue, nor the nature of governance in a communist society. Dealing with these questions is the focus of this chapter. Although I undertake the task with an important caveat. Engels, and indeed Marx, never experienced the actual exercise of power after a communist revolution. They were fully aware of this reality, warning that such analysis can be undertaken only scientifically, only from actual experience. As Engels points out on a number of occasions, he and Marx were not in the business of creating utopian systems for the organization of future society. The chapter has two main sections. The first part analyzes a number of brief statements by Engels and Marx that may be collated as follows. Public Gewalt loses its political character and becomes the administration of things and the conduct of the forces and relations of production for the genuine good of society. The statements are notably brief, even formulaic, for the good reason that they had, in their context, no extensive data on the actual practice of socialist governance. There was, however, an abundance of information from another source, pre-state forms of social organization that existed in many parts of the world. It was precisely to this source of information that Engels devoted considerable energy in the 1880s. Here, he found complex and many-layered types of what he carefully called social organization, which was not separated from but stood in the midst of society. They were not separated from society, not manifestations and means of class struggle, and thus did not constitute a state. Here, I seek to develop a terminology based on Engels which speaks of the enmeshed governance of baseline communism, with its attendant and indeed first form of human democracy. This is all very well, based as it was on the available historical and anthropological material of the time, but what relevance does it have for the enmeshed governance of socialism, let alone communism? To answer this question, I focus on the remarkable work from 1882, The Mark. Here, Engels outlines his research into this feature of German social life from its earliest days to the present. The point, directed explicitly at peasant farmers, is that the communism of the future would entail a dialectical transformation, Aufhebung, of this baseline communism. Far from a hankering for the rural socialism of the European Middle Ages, or for an idealized primitive communism, or even for a secularized version of the religious return to paradise, this dialectical transformation would both negate this baseline communism and transform its core features into a qualitatively different reality. Given that such a form of governance would stand in the midst of society, it cannot be called a state. Indeed, we reach the limits of the language derived from the Western European tradition, for with this type of enmeshed governance it becomes increasingly difficult to speak of the separation of state and society. The concluding chapter to the book summarizes Engels' basic principles concerning the nature of socialist governance. 1. Public power, Gewalt, continues but loses its political character. 2. Governance entails the administration of things and the management of the processes of production for the sake of the true interests of society. 3. The many organs of governance would not be separated from society, but stand in the midst of society. 4. This reality may be seen as a dialectical transformation and Aufhebung of baseline communism. I ask whether these principles are being realized even partially in socialist countries today. I also examine what such a governance may be called, since state, understood as a separated public power, is not appropriate in Engels's term, and I ask how we may understand the question of continuity and discontinuity. On this matter, it is important to strike a realistic balance, to suggest that Engels and indeed Marx foresaw, or perhaps should have foreseen, all of the developments in later efforts to construct socialism is simply unrealistic. To propose that later historical realities departed significantly from the original thoughts of the founders is even more extreme and not sustained by the evidence. Far better is a balanced approach. Thus, there is clearly significant continuity, much more than one might expect, between the initial philosophical foundations and the historical realities of socialist governance. At the same time, in the actual construction of socialism from the Soviet Union to China, one would expect to face new problems for which new solutions were and are needed, albeit based on the initial principles and method through which they were derived. As Engels put it in 1890, so-called socialist society is not, in my view, to be regarded as something that remains crystallized for all time, but rather being in process of constant change and transformation, like all other social conditions. Approach to citations. Finally, a word on the approach to citations. In all possible cases, the primary citation is to the original language text by Engels and Marx where relevant. These are in German, French, and Italian, mostly available in the standard collections, but at times they are not, since neither collection is complete. In most cases, I provide my own translation to highlight particular features of the text, or at least a modification of the standard English translation found in the collected works. At the same time, and for ease of reference for readers, I provide a reference to the English version, even if the translation offered does not conform to this version. End of Chapter 1. To hear the full version of this and many more audiobooks, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support.